despite their potential to torpedo the world economy.
Would you be open to a pause in tariffs to allow for negotiations?
Well, we're not looking at that.
And up against all of that economic chaos, Canada's federal leaders tried to prove they are the best candidate to weather this storm.
We can give ourselves far more than the U.S. can take away.
We actually need to invest in our country.
It's time to put Canada first for a change.
It's day 16 of the federal election campaign, and Power and Politics starts right now. All right, we've got the Power Panel standing by to talk about everything that happened on day 16 of the election campaign, but we're going to begin with a look at the markets. This is where the main U.S. indexes landed after a roller coaster day. They came into this week after their biggest two-day losses since March of 2020 when the COVID-19 shutdowns began. Peter Armstrong is a CBC senior business correspondent, and he is in Toronto. So, Peter, quite a bit of fluctuation today. I mean, what do we make of what we're seeing on the markets?
Yeah, it's been nice to have just this last little 45 minutes or so to catch my breath after an incredibly volatile and, frankly, David, kind of weird day. That, like, the sell-off began in Asia, it ripped through Europe, and then all the futures markets here were showing we're going to see another sharp sell-off in North American markets. It opened down substantially. Like the NASDAQ was down 5 or 6%, the S&P was down 4%, the Dow plunged like 1,000 points at the open. And then right around 10 o'clock, and this is just like to give you an example of what markets are doing, around 10 o'clock this morning, a social media account that everybody on Wall Street kind of follows, but it's an anonymous account, posts this thing that says the White House is considering this 90-day pause on tariffs and with everybody except for China to just kind of give a break and give everybody a chance to start negotiating. Well, CNBC, the financial news channel, they ran it. Reuters ran it. Markets sort of just gobbled it up because it's the greatest thing that they've been waiting to hear for 3 days of trading. And markets that were down sharply shot up, bounced all the way back into positive territory before anybody thought to say, well, hold on a second, what's the source on this? And when they did, they found out there was no truth to it at all. The White House says it's completely fake news. You had the president speaking, this is hours after this incident, saying, no, we're not even looking at that. And sure enough, markets sharply sell back off again. The sell-off resumes. And then slowly over the course of the day, you get the sense that investors are just so searching for some clarity and some sense that they still don't believe that Trump is really going to see this through. So where is the bottom here? If there is a deal in the offing, can we get in now? Markets ended the day. The NASDAQ was in positive territory. The S&P and the Dow were down, but only down slightly.
Okay, so what do we watch for? Because, Peter, I watched the president today, and it's like tariffs are in place. They may go up, they may not. They will stay in place, they're permanent, but they might not be. And there could be negotiations, but my policies won't change business, so feel free to invest. So the policy of the moment isn't even clear. So the chaos and the mixed messaging from the markets, what do we watch for over the rest of this week?
Well, I think tomorrow is going to be crucial because this next round of tariffs, they all kick in at midnight tomorrow night. So, Scott Bessent, the Treasury Secretary, has said that they've got more than 50 countries that have come to the White House that are calling the White House, coming to them to try to make some kind of a deal. But as you say, what might that deal be? Benjamin Netanyahu from Israel was sitting in the Oval Office with the president today, and on the morning they announced these tariffs last week, Israel said, that's it, we're going to wipe out, we're going to eliminate all of our tariffs. They got slapped with a 17% tariff. He reiterated that promise today, and Trump said, I don't know, maybe we'll take a look at it. So there's no promise that tariffs alone are enough. And Peter Navarro was on CNBC talking about this earlier this afternoon, or in fact this morning, saying tariffs aren't even what we're talking about. If you eliminate all your tariffs, that's like the tiniest first step. We're looking at how you tax stuff. It is so much deeper than that. And so there's no real sense of what it might be. So I think what everybody is looking for is some kind of a deal with somebody. I think Israel might be the first out of the gates to try to get close to something. And then they can use that as some kind of an example or a model for everybody else. But until we get that, I think all this volatility, these swings up and swings down, are going to be just kind of the norm.
He tariffed an island full of penguins. I don't know how to apply rational analysis to this. Thanks for trying with us. That's the CBC senior business correspondent, Peter Armstrong. Okay, we're going to begin there with the power panel. We've got Rob Russo. He is the Canada correspondent for The Economist. Rachel Siegel is a former director of policy in Stephen Harper's government and the co-host of the Beyond a Ballot podcast. And here with me in studio, Jonathan Kalis. He was a Quebec advisor to former Prime Minister Justin Trudeau. And Jordan Leichnitz is a former NDP strategist. It's good to see you all on one of the weirdest financial Mondays. Rob, why don't we start with you? I don't know what's going to, I'm not going to actually do market and economic analysis, but, you know, people hoping, the Conservatives, for instance, that maybe Trump would stop being the dominant thing sort of in the conversation. How do you think they feel after this today? Because it just seems that even if he doesn't take direct action, the consequences of his actions are just radiating throughout everything.
Yeah, I mean, look, if you've got money in a pension fund, if you have an RSP, if you have an RESP, you can't go too far and too deep into the news without a barf bag. It was a roller coaster today, but the ride has been down and down at a vertiginous level. And I'm in an area of the country. I'm in Vancouver today. I'm going to head into the interior in a little while, and everybody is worried and talking about what happens on softwood lumber, because he's about to more than double the tariff that he's put on softwood lumber, which is it's a huge industry in British Columbia, and a huge industry when it comes to people who want to build homes or anything else in the United States. It's inflationary. People are scratching their heads. There's dread, there's fear, and there is mystification. How do you negotiate with a man who, when countries respond in kind, let's take China, for instance.
Right.
We'll see your 34%, we'll put 34% on as well. And then he responds with, I'll see your 34% and I will raise you 50%. No one knows how to negotiate with that. And no one knows how to deal with it, including people who backed him. Somebody like Bill Ackman, the head of the Pershing Square investment fund, who has turned tail on Mr. Trump and has said he's gone too far. He's killing the markets, and he might be favoring the bond market as well as what he's doing.
Yeah, Bill Ackman is tweeting through the pain right now in a way that I didn't expect. Rachel, I mean, what are your thoughts on this? I know, you know, the common wisdom in this election is if Trump remains the ballot question, it favors Mark Carney. You know, it's only Monday, the beginning of week 3, but how do you think this affects the solidity of that ballot question right now as we get near the midway point?
Well, I think that Canadians will get to a point where they're asking, you know, how do we negotiate with such volatility? And really, you can't. I mean, we're exhausted of the back and forth of the last few days, last few weeks, last few months. And so I think that the thing that Pierre is doing right is that he's talking about putting Canada first and building our economy, that we will come from a place of strength and not weakness when it comes to negotiating with Donald Trump. They can fight all they want about who's better, whose personality is better to deal with the President of the United States. At the end of the day, it's about domestic policy in Canada and how we position ourselves at home after the last 10 years of a crumbling economy. And so I think for the Conservatives today, this is really the message that they're trying to get out, is that they have a plan for Canadians. We saw Pierre Poilievre in northern British Columbia today talking about resource development and getting pipelines in the ground to support the economy long term. I think we'll hear more of that message, and ultimately Canadians will go to the ballot box and say, everyone can fight with Trump, but who's going to do something for me within my own borders?
Jono, how do you see it? Because it seems that when Trump is front and center, your crowd does well. I mean, how do you see this affecting the campaign at the beginning of week 3?
Well, now that we've entered this volatility in the stock market, I mean, it's been like that from the beginning of the year, but now it really is dramatic. And yes, we were expecting Black Monday, and it wasn't as bad as we thought it would be when we woke up this morning. That's what we're left with is good news. It's not just, you know, Canadians from across the country go, well, I'm not in the auto sector, or I don't work in softwood lumber, or I'm not in aluminum and steel, so I haven't been impacted. I'm not going to be laid off. I guess things will be okay. Now it's my savings have just disappeared, or they're half of what they were a week ago. So it's now really starting to impact everybody. And why does it favor, why are people, at least in polls and when they answer questions, why is there a connection to Mark Carney? It's that he doesn't end every sentence with, let's put Canada first for a change, but he comes off as this sort of boring, serious banker guy who actually understands what this is all about, who sees all the pieces moving, who has experience, like real world experience in dealing with crises, with these kind of crises. It's not about grievance. It's not about having good one-liners. It's not just about a CV. It's he has a plan. He talks about it. He sees how all of this is intertwined and is giving you reassurance that he's going to get through it. He's going to help us get through it. He doesn't paint this rosy picture that everything's going to be fine. He says, no, this is going to be tough, but I'm going to help us through it. I have a plan, and it's the reassurance right now that's making a difference.
Jordan, what's your view of where things stand now that the market effect is gone kind of topsy-turvy?
Yeah, I think this is bad news for the Conservatives for sure, because this is exactly what we talked about last week when we talked about some of the opportunities that Trump would have to reinsert himself into the campaign. And we're like less than a week out from the announcement of the tariffs, and already there's now this roller coaster up and down based on rumors, based on nothing, and that's materially impacting people's investments. And I think John makes a really important point that's exactly bang on, which is that this type of market movement actually makes the personal impact of what Trump is doing extend beyond the sectors that have been immediately impacted by the tariffs.
Right.
This is now everybody's business. This is something everybody is feeling in their own lives. And it's making people feel, I think, first and foremost, concerned, afraid, and they're looking for a steady hand and leadership. And so it's maybe not a surprise in that scenario that they're turning more towards Mark Carney and away from Pierre Poilievre, because the truth is that that's not a feeling of grievance. That's not about what happened in the past. People are looking for somebody to provide some leadership for what's going to happen in the future.
Right. Okay. Look, I want to show you what one premier said today and what was said about one premier in the last little while, because in response to these tariffs, Ontario is giving businesses a break.
We're just going to postpone people having to pay their taxes and take the burden off them, for companies, I should say, for about roughly 6 months, I believe.
So Premier Doug Ford has given businesses a deferral on some provincial taxes. He says this will be about $9 billion worth of relief. Meanwhile, Liberal leader Mark Carney, he's getting a bit of criticism for poking fun at Alberta Premier Danielle Smith. This was as he takes his campaign out west. Here's Carney speaking at a rally last night, and then we'll show you the reaction from Danielle Smith.
We're fighting them on Fox News, which is what they understand. We're sending Doug Ford onto Fox News to show them that we're not messing around up here. And we're going to send Danielle next. Maybe we won't send her. Maybe we'll send Danielle. No, maybe we won't. We won't send Danielle.
Well, I've noticed this with progressive men, how much they talk about how much they support women until they meet a strong conservative woman. And so this is a pretty consistent type of approach that I've seen, not only from the current Prime Minister, but the former one as well. And the attitude is, sit down and shut up. Well, I don't shut up.
All right, Rachel, I wonder, what do you think of that? I mean, Doug Ford has become this ally of Mark Carney, I think it's kind of safe to say, because, you know, what he said there about Ford going on Fox News, some people tried to say he was being dismissive of Ford, and Ford's like, he just texted me, of course I'm going on Fox News. But the Danielle Smith situation, that ain't going over so well. What are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, I mean, so much for the all-Canada approach when you're trying to throw premiers under the bus to make the crowd laugh at your fundraiser in Victoria. I just listened to the other two talk about the professionalism of Mark Carney, and here he is making fun of the two premiers that have made leaps and bounds in these negotiations, including Doug Ford, who took over for the previous Liberal leader at the time we needed it the most, when his cabinet and his government were falling apart. So I don't think that's a very good look for Mark Carney. But also going back to kind of what Jono was saying, today at the wildest day on the stock market, I want to juxtapose the two leaders. So we had Pierre Poilievre talking about resource development and growing the economy. We had Mark Carney out talking about building parks and free summer vacations in Canada's parks. At a point, Canadians are going to say, how do we get out of this economic mess? And when you look at the history of terrible markets, for example, 2008, when we had Prime Minister Harper, we had Canada's Economic Action Plan, where we invested in resources, we invested in transportation, infrastructure projects, and Canada fared really well. Who today is of the two leaders are talking about that? That's Pierre Poilievre, not Mark Carney. And I think that as we continue the next couple of weeks of this campaign, and there is an eternity left in this race, that message will become clearer and clearer to Canadians as they say, this instability in the United States is hurting me, it's hurting my pocketbook, it's hurting my family, it's hurting future generations, and it's time that we invest in the leader that is going to invest in this country long term.
Jono?
Well, I mean, that's just too easy, Rachel. You just left it out there that, you know, in 2008, Pierre Poilievre was, I don't know, a backbench MP. Maybe he was a parliamentary secretary with no role. And Mark Carney was working with Prime Minister Harper and the Finance Minister Flaherty to get us through it. That means he has experience, he knows what he's doing, when Pierre was doing nothing. So I think that's what Canadians are reacting to. That's what they want to hear is the steady hand, the experience, and you know, what exactly is Pierre Poilievre, other than the grievance about everything that the Liberals have done wrong, what is the plan? He just keeps articulating the same 5 talking points, but there's no plan. And he doesn't actually understand how the economy works because he's never actually worked in the economy.
I mean, there are specific promises to speed up resource development and pipelines and blast away environmental policy that he sees as a hurdle to be in the way, right? So it is resource extraction is speeding that up is a big part of the plan, right? Sorry, Rachel, quickly.
Seniors policies, tax cuts. Pierre Poilievre has been out there announcing something new every day. Mark Carney took days off of this campaign to sit in Ottawa and be Prime Minister, but Pierre has been out there talking about his long-term plan and his entire platform, and I think Canadians are starting to really clue into that.
Okay, Rob, and then Jordan.
Sure. Last week we criticized MPs because in the guise of trying to crack a joke, they ended up losing their jobs as nominees. At this moment, I think Mark Carney has won plaudits and won support because he's considered quite serious when it comes to the economy. I think that he's not auditioning for open mic night at Yuck Yucks, and he does himself no favors when he does this. This is off-brand for him, and it's off-brand in terms of his target as well. Tonight, Mr. Poilievre is going to have a huge rally in Edmonton. There's a reason why he's in Edmonton, though, because the Liberals are actually doing fairly well in Edmonton, and he's bringing out Stephen Harper because the Liberals are doing fairly well. And Alberta is not going to be doing fairly well over the next little while. The price of oil dipped below $60 a barrel for the first time in a long, long time today. Every dollar below $68 is $750 million less in revenue for the province of Alberta. So I think that was a clunker for Mr. Carney, and I think it risks stalling some of the momentum that he and his party have had, particularly around the city of Edmonton. When he was doing well, that was off brand for him.
Yeah, Jordan, it's interesting. I spoke to a conservative though in Alberta who told me that in the cities, Daniel Smith is becoming an issue at the doors, and not in a good way for them, which is interesting, right? Like just how there's so many different, impacts of all of these things in this campaign. Yeah. But this was not the sort of thing Carney has done up until now.
No, and I think that this is also, rallies can be great, but they can also lead politicians to play to the room, and this is...
Oh, hang on, I think your mic is dead there, Jordan. I don't know if it's not working. Let me just check and see if it's even on. Let's check that. That's her earpiece. I'm going to do a bit of tech support here. I can't find her mic. Okay, I'll tell you what. We're going to come back to you. I'm going to just, we're going to play a bit of tape. We're going to show you what's happening with Mark Carney today, because the Liberal leader was in British Columbia for the first time during this campaign. He was in Victoria this morning to make a couple of policy announcements, and he later met with Premier David Eby. Afterwards, Carney returned to the mainland for a rally tonight in Richmond.
Many Canadians are understandably worried about their jobs and their retirement savings, which is why, anticipating this need, we announced this morning that we will help to protect Canadians' retirement savings from this market uncertainty. And then on the world.
Carney is announcing new measures to help seniors in the wake of the steep losses in the stock market. The CBC's Catherine Tunney is following his campaign. Catherine.
David, Liberal leader Mark Carney brought his campaign to a picturesque cider house here on lush Vancouver Island today. But look at the markets, and things are anything but serene. With the stocks in turmoil and U.S. President Donald Trump's global trade war stirring uncertainty for Canadian savings and investment, Carney made a specific pitch to retirees today, promising temporary support. First, he says he will lower the minimum amount that must be withdrawn from a registered retirement income fund by 25% for a year. Carney also pledged to boost the guaranteed income supplement by 5% to help low-income seniors, again, for a year. This is an announcement that the Liberals say they felt they had to move up to today as Canadians watch their investments in anguish. Just another sign of a federal election pivoting to deal with an unpredictable White House. David?
All right, Kat, thanks very much. This is CBC's Catherine Tunney in Victoria. Okay, Jordan, before you were so rudely interrupted by a mic malfunction, let's get to your thoughts. What do you have to say?
Yeah, well, I think one of the things that Carney's comment and the way it's going over speaks to is the challenge for politicians when they're performing in a rally space. So they're often trying to appeal to the room, trying to win the room. They're playing, in Pierre Poilievre's case, we can call it his greatest hits about defunding CBC, among other things. And some of those things don't play so well outside of the room. And I think that, that's a skill that's learned for politicians. And of course, Mr. Carney has not had a lot of opportunity to learn that. But his real offer, the value that he's bringing in this campaign, is a steady hand, is being about as boring as a gray wall. And so this kind of thing is not helpful for him, and it's a bit of a distraction. But I thought it was really interesting to hear Pierre Poilievre today and frame up his resource announcement talking so much about the Conservative government's record, because I think we should take him seriously when he talks about his propositions. But when we look back at the record of the Conservative government in approving major projects, they were not able to get it done either. So it's not necessarily a winner to go back in time and say that we're going to have the same approach that the Harper Conservative has when they weren't able to get these projects to Tidewater either. In fact, the government that was able to get the project done that he's talking about was a BC NDP government.
Yeah, well, there were issues with Indigenous consultation, the shale market surge in the United States to change the economics for a lot of things. So beyond policy, there were economic factors and legal issues.
And there are political issues as well. And his own candidate in northern BC, where he was today, in fact, actually opposed Northern Gateway at the time. So these are not straightforward issues, even in the regions where he's trying to peddle a uniquely pro-development message.
Okay, we're going to take a look at where the race is, as it is day 16 of the federal election campaign and just 3 weeks until Election Day. So what is the current state of the race as this third week of the campaign gets underway? Well, as luck would have it, Eric Grenier is here. He is the author of the Writ.ca. He also runs the poll tracker at CBC News.ca. Okay, Eric, big picture, how are the parties currently polling?
Well, we haven't really seen actually that much movement in the polls over the last little while, and we can look at where the polling average is. This is a compilation of all the polls that are being published throughout this campaign. We have the Liberals right now leading with 44% support across the country. The Conservatives are in second with 37%, and again, hasn't seen too much movement over the last little while. The New Democrats are now just under 9% support on average, the Bloc Québécois at 5%, and the Greens at 2.5%. So that gap between the Liberals and the Conservatives has been holding around that 6-7 point mark for the last few days.
Okay, I think at around 37-38%, Stephen Harper had a majority. So how does this translate into seat projections in this election?
Yeah, it really makes a difference who is on top, right? So if we look at the seat projections so far, where things stand right now in our projections, there we go, on this side, the Liberals. Right now projected to win 204 seats. There's a range of 185 to 219, so there is a little bit of uncertainty about just how much they would win if an election were held today. The Conservatives are at 117 seats, so would actually drop a few from where they were in the last election. The Bloc Québécois is at 17 in the projection. The New Democrats are at 4 with a range of between 1 and 11 seats, and the Greens are at 1 seat with a range of about 0 to 2.
Okay, even the most optimistic Liberal I speak with doesn't see 204, but who knows, right? Weird elections, but like Carney and Poilievre were campaigning in BC today, so let's have a look at that province. Where does that currently stand, Eric?
Yeah, well, I mean, the reason why the Liberals are so high in the projections are in part because of the numbers we see in these battleground regions. So we can take a look at where things stand right now. In British Columbia, the Liberals are leading right now with about 43%. In BC, the Conservatives are at second with 38. The NDP is at only 13, and the Greens are at only 4. This is one of the reasons why the Liberals are projected to win as many seats as they are, is because they are leading in BC, and with the NDP and Green numbers down so much, there could be a lot of potential pickups for the Liberals. And in Ontario, I mean, this is where elections are always decided, and there we see as well that the Liberals do have a pretty big lead in Ontario. If we can take a look at the Ontario numbers right now, we have the Liberals leading with, we'll have to wait till those numbers come up.
We got a lag. It's coming. They tell me it's coming, Eric. Great. Oh, there we go.
Right.
There we go.
Hey, they were just ticked
Okay,
up.
so those Liberal numbers are even bigger in Ontario, right? 49%. That's massive, right?
Yeah, 49%, nearing 50% in the polls in Ontario. The Conservatives are at 38%. The more important number might be the gap between the two. We're looking at right now what is nearly an 11-point gap between the Liberals and the Conservatives in Ontario. The NDP at just 8% support in the polls. In the province, the Greens at 2%. And because the Liberals have that much support in Ontario, they are in a position to win 80, 90 seats in the province. If they can pull that off, if these numbers hold, I mean, that's the ball game right there.
Right. Okay. And just on that, like Eric, for the Conservatives to have a credible path to a majority, they need 70 seats in Ontario, right? Like they either need to come way up or the Liberals need to go way down. So what are you watching for in the polling in week 3 of the election campaign?
Well, looking to see what's going to happen with some of these numbers, because we've actually seen some divergence in some of the polls. There's been a handful of polls that have been coming out showing the gap is very close between the Conservatives and the Liberals. We've seen some that show a 10 or 12-point lead for the Liberals, which would just be a massive, well over 200 seats for the party. When we look at what's the consensus of the polls, most of them do seem to be in between that kind of 0-point race versus a 10-point race. But the important point for the Conservatives is that even at that 0-point race, that tie, the Liberals probably still win more seats. So even in the worst polls for the Liberals, the best polls for the Conservatives, Mark Carney probably still comes out on top.
You need to see a Conservative lead 3-4 points. Is that what we're thinking?
3-4 points at least for a minority, not for a majority.
Right. Okay. Eric, always appreciate it. That's Eric Grenier with the writ.ca. Okay, let's bring it back here to the panel. Because there was a focus on British Columbia, let's go to our people who are in British Columbia. Rachel, when you look at those numbers, the Liberals and the Conservatives are both going to gain, it would suggest. But the Conservatives need to be in first place there, if not in vote share, but definitely in seat count by a pretty good margin if they're going to carry things on the 28th. So what's your sense of how things are happening in BC?
Well, first of all, David, I told you weeks ago that it would be battleground BC, and we were going to be very important in this race, so I'm feeling good about myself. The other thing is in BC, that NDP vote is so important. I mean, I'm seeing polls out here that they could pick up 1 seat, the NDP, in a province that has an NDP government, has a strong federal NDP presence here. That is really affecting the outcome for the Conservatives here. But in terms also Saanich Gulf Islands in British Columbia, which is held by Elizabeth May, the co-leader of the Greens, is also not secure for her. That's traditionally been a Conservative riding, and we'll see how that one plays out as well. But BC is one to watch on election night. With that said, in terms of the federal polls, I mean, we have a long time until Election Day still, to the dismay of many tired staffers across the country.
And journalists.
And journalists. But there's a couple of big things that I'm watching, one being the debate. So we know that they are doing a French debate, not Mark Carney's strongest language, and then the English debate. Pierre Poilievre is an incredible orator. His policy, like I said earlier, has been very clear. He's come out with massive policies every day of this campaign. Mark Carney, on the other hand, hasn't. So what will they be talking about at that debate? And then, of course, Election Day, and what Canadians go to the ballot box feeling, where Donald Trump is at that point, and whether or not Pierre Poilievre can make that argument that it's the domestic policies, it's the Canada First policies that will be impacting Canadians, that's what they should be voting for.
Rob, I don't know how long you've been in Vancouver, but what's your sense of how the race is out there?
Well, I mean, one of the reasons I'm here is because I asked Eric Grenier where I should go to look at what was happening, and he suggested that I come here. And tomorrow I'm going to a riding, Abbotsford.
Right.
A Liberal has not been elected in Abbotsford since I was a toddler, probably, and they have a chance. They have a chance there because there is a bit of a split on the right, but there is some strength there that hasn't been seen for a long, long time. And look at where the leaders are going. Mr. Carney was in Victoria today. Not a lot of Liberals elected on Vancouver Island. That's usually NDP versus Conservative. He's going to be in Saskatchewan later this week. Who's coming to Burnaby over the next few days? I'm told that Jagmeet Singh is coming to Burnaby to defend his own riding fairly early in the campaign. So yeah, there's lots happening in British Columbia, happening for the Liberals, and it's if things hold, this could be the cherry on top of a victory for the Liberals if things hold.
Yeah.
I think we heard a mention there of the debates. Right now, they're practicing for the debates. They might be campaigning, but part of their day is spent in debate prep and practicing. That will be very, very important as well.
Yeah, I think the last Liberal to win Victoria would have been David Anderson, who was the fisheries minister, if I remember correctly. So, Jordan, when you look at that, I mean, the bulk of the NDP caucus is in British Columbia. And, you know, the way the national polls are, I mean, last week I think Eric had them at 3. This week he has them at 4. So, I mean, it's better to be going in that direction, right?
We'll take it, David.
Yeah, I know. And I mean, Mr. Singh is not talking about being prime minister anymore. It's about electing new Democrats. And eventually you see them maybe hunkering down a little bit. I mean, what are your thoughts on how BC is splitting right now, how it affects your crowd?
Well, look, BC is unquestionably very important for New Democrats. That's where their greatest seat density is and where they have a lot of strength, I would say, also on the ground, of course. You've got really strong incumbents. You've got people like Peter Julian, like Don Davies, like Jenny Kwan, and on Vancouver Island, you know, popular mayor running in Esquimalt. So there's good candidates. There's excellent ground game there. You know, you had Premier Eby out on Friday telling people to vote NDP. And I think that what's going to be really important in British Columbia is that we know that there's a lot of voters out there who their first choice would be to vote NDP, but they're concerned both about Trump and they're also concerned about Pierre Poilievre.
Right.
And they are wanting to, maybe at this moment, they're considering voting strategically to stop him. So what's going to be important over the next couple of weeks for the NDP is creating a bit of a permission structure, a pathway for those voters to feel comfortable that Pierre Poilievre is not going to win and to feel confident that they can come back and they can vote where they want to vote with the NDP. They can re-elect some of their good MPs there and gain back some of the vote share that way.
Jono, when people look at the lead, because the Liberals, while not leading in every region, the Atlantic, Quebec, Ontario, and BC, that's the 4 pillars of a Liberal government, and you're leading there. They point to the debate. How bad do you think Mark Carney would have to do in the debate to fundamentally alter the nature of this race?
The debates, any number of debates, first of all, in Quebec itself, Yves-François Blanchet has come out of the 2 debates where he's run as leader, and he has improved his polling numbers.
Yeah.
In 2019.
And that's the threat in Quebec, for
and
sure.
And in 2021. Yeah. And as Quebec goes, very often the rest of the country goes. So I don't know that you would see the exact same surge everywhere, but there's an interesting comparison or parallel between the NDP and the Bloc. And it just sort of, one is in Quebec and one is in the rest of the country, which is this a binary campaign? Is this a binary election? Your choice is binary. It's Poilievre or Carney, and that's it. And everyone else just doesn't matter. You know, or as Jordan said, you know, do we get back to a point where, well, okay, it looks like Team A is going to win, so I can give my vote to Team C or D because it's not going to impact the overall. That's what the Bloc and the NDP are hoping for. You know, Blanchet today was saying, I never look at the polls. The polls never tell me anything. I always do well after the debates. But by the way, the polls are wrong. So he's starting to get desperate. You didn't hear him say that in 2019, in 2021, where, you know, now he has seats that he's afraid of losing as opposed to picking them up. And for the Liberals, what they really need to start focusing on is, okay, people have a sense of who Mark Carney is now. They didn't have that a month ago or 2. They think he's a very credible option. How do the Liberals convert that into a ground game? How do they make sure that people who are inclined to vote for him go out and vote?
Right.
And there's 3 weeks to go. There's a lot of work to do. This is not a done deal.
So, Jordan, if I can, I'd like to explore the psychology of the NDP voter for a second, a little bit more in this dynamic. You say they need to be comfortable that they're assured essentially of a Liberal government and not a Conservative government before they go back to the New Democrats, who they voted for last time. What does that look like? You know, does it have to be the Eric Grenier 200-seat projection, or is just an overall vibe that Carney's probably going to win, whether it's a minority or a majority? Does it need to be a majority because of Trump? How do you view it?
I think it needs to be a sense that they feel comfortable, that there will be some sort of a wave, some sort of a majority happening. Now, most people are not, with due respect to Eric, they're not following in that level of granular detail.
Of course,
right?
of course.
They're talking to their friends and family. They're trying to find out what's happening, where the wind's blowing on the election. So they need that sense that it's inevitable at this point, or that there is a certainty that Carney and the Liberals will form government. And so the number to watch there, of course, is something that is polled on frequently, which is who do people think is going to win?
Right.
And so we are seeing that number rise for the Liberals, which is probably a necessary precondition for some of those NDP voters coming back. And I do think that the other thing that the NDP has to do then is make a case to pull those voters back. And so that's what you're seeing Jagmeet Singh out there doing, talking about why it matters, why it's important to have New Democrats in that parliament, especially in the case of a majority Liberal government, to be there to defend the things like healthcare, like social programs that Canadians rely on. And look at all the things that they were able to get with just 24 MPs. Imagine what they can do if there's more.
So Rob...
David, if I can...
Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, very quickly here. The other party that needs the NDP to come up, of course, is the Conservatives.
Yeah.
Because without a robust NDP, they can't win a lot of ridings. They depend on three-way splits. I'm looking for Mr. Harper tonight, former Prime Minister, to be the guy who really goes after Mark Carney tonight. They have to begin to put a dent in his reputation. Mr. Harper worked with Mark Carney. He's going to have to, if he ever took questions, answer the question of why he wanted him to be finance minister as opposed to Mr. Poilievre. But I look for Mr. Harper to really go after Mr. Carney at the rally tonight, and to do so with that in mind as well, to try and get New Democrats to feel less comfortable with Mr. Carney too. So watch for that tonight.
How hard can he go at the guy, though, that he offered the finance minister's job to? Because he's had many, many, many opportunities now to say that that is not a true story, and he has never taken the opportunity. So that tells you that was at least the conversation. How hard do you go at the guy who offered that job?
I would be surprised if he took questions after his speech.
Yeah.
But he's going to say, as the guy who knows Mark Carney, here's what I can tell you about him, and here's what I can tell you about Pierre Poilievre, and allow Mr. Poilievre. He hasn't been able to back off, Mr. Poilievre. He's, as we all know, the most pugnacious politician in Canada. Mm-hmm. And at times he sounds Trumpy. Even his own people will say that. Tonight, he might be able to stand back a little bit. He doesn't have to toss the red meat. Mr. Harper will toss the red meat tonight.
Rachel, quick thoughts on what Mr. Harper might say and what impact it might have before we give the update from the Conservative campaign today.
Well, you have to remember that Pierre Poilievre used to work for Prime Minister Harper as his staffer as well. He was the parliamentary, somebody mentioned that Pierre was a parliamentary secretary. He was the parliamentary secretary to the Prime Minister, to Stephen Harper, many years ago. And so they have a close relationship. I think what we're going to get is really a look at who Pierre Poilievre is and who Mark Carney really is, in the words of the former Prime Minister. But what I'm looking for tonight is just how many people are in that room. We cannot go on without talking about the numbers of Canadians that are coming out in droves to these rallies across the country in small farming communities, not downtown metropolises. People really want to see him. They want to hear his plan that he's put forward. And I think tonight's going to be extremely exciting in Edmonton for the Conservatives.
No, the expectation is 10, 11,000 or more. And they have been massive crowds, there's no question. Well, Conservative leader Pierre Poilievre is sharpening his attack against his main rival, who happens to be the Liberal leader, Mark Carney. Poilievre started day 16 with a policy announcement in Terrace, British Columbia, before heading to Edmonton for that rally tonight, where, as we've been discussing, he will be joined by that special guest, former Prime Minister Stephen Harper.
As soon as Justin Trudeau and his economic advisor Mark Carney got their hands on Canada's resource policy, they began blocking projects. They brought in an industrial carbon tax and C-69, the no pipelines, no development law, and they've capped energy production in Canada.
Poilievre is promising one-and-done project approvals with wait times limited to just a single year. Carney announced something similar last month. The CBC's Marina von Stackelberg is with Poilievre's campaign. Marina.
Hey David, I'm in Edmonton where Pierre Poilievre is going to be holding one of his rallies this evening just south of the city. It is in a conservative stronghold and his organizers say they expect this to be his biggest one yet. He's also going to have a special guest. Former Prime Minister Stephen Harper will be there to introduce him. Of course, these two go way back. Poilievre was a cabinet minister under Harper's government. Now, to get there, Poilievre will be flying in from northern BC. That's where he made an announcement this morning. He's promising to cut down on the red tape he says is slowing down resource development projects. He's promising to bring in just one environmental review and one application per project, and putting a rule that those have to be completed within 1 year. Now, this is a significant promise to be making in this part of the country where natural gas and oil development is top of mind. David.
Thank you, Marina. This is CBC's Marina von Stackelberg in Edmonton. Well, NDP leader Jagmeet Singh continues to focus his campaign on affordability. Singh was back in Toronto today making a pledge to fix the housing crisis before heading to Vancouver, where Singh is playing defense in his own riding of Burnaby South.
Our plan is to build 3 million homes in the next 5 years. Not just build those homes, but build homes that people can actually afford.
Singh says an NDP government would double the Housing Accelerator Fund. The CBC's Ashley Burke is traveling with his campaign. Ashley.
David, we're almost halfway through this campaign and the NDP is very aware of the uphill battle it's facing. The party is stuck, trailing far behind the Liberals and Conservatives in the polls, and is at risk at being squeezed out if it doesn't turn things around. The party's leader, Jagmeet Singh, is here in Toronto today trying to get his voice heard in the conversation dominating this race, Donald Trump and his tariff war. Singh said the stress and uncertainty of Trump is making people more worried about their future and is pledging to double the pace of construction in Canada to build 3 million homes over the next 5 years, including affordable housing, a plan with a $16 billion price tag. Singh defended that plan to spend that much money during a time of economic uncertainty, saying if Canada does slide into a recession, he wouldn't cut his way out of it. He would end things like private consultants and tax loopholes to help foot the bill. Now he's trying to hold on to a handful of seats here in Ontario and win even more, and he's headed to BC next, where half his caucus is and where polls suggest that his own seat could be in jeopardy. David?
Thank you, Ashley. This is CBC's Ashley Burke in Toronto. Okay, let's bring back the power panel here. Rachel, you raised this right out of the gate, and we just saw it there in the report from Pierre Poilievre's campaign, that he is focusing on project approval and industrial growth. Mark Carney did have a similar policy on this, at least in intention, if not the details. What do you make of that? That for the first time in a long time, the Liberals are trying to match the Conservatives on industrial policy. We've not seen this in the last couple of elections. How do you think that's going to play?
Well, I think just going back to what Jordan was talking about with a lot of the NDP voters and how when they get in a ballot box, they might want to go back to Jagmeet Singh. That's going to play out. We're going to see that in the next couple of weeks. But I will differentiate Mark Carney's policies from Pierre Poilievre. I mean, Pierre Poilievre was out today talking about how he'll get LNG 2 passed. He was talking about getting rid of red tape and regulation to build Canada. And going back to originally what we were talking about with Trump, this is a long-term investment in our economy and building that. He was out with somebody that I know quite well, Ellis Ross, who was a former MLA in British Columbia. This was a guy who was the chief of the Haisla Nation, and in that time, Haisla got 50% ownership in BC LNG, and that was life-changing for them and continues to be to this day. And so I thought it was poignant that Pierre was up in the north talking about resource development and how that just makes Canada stronger. I think that ultimately, again, that question going into the ballot box will be, do you want to invest in somebody who wants to take use our resources that we have to build our economy, or do you want somebody who won't repeal C-69, said he won't, and won't build any more pipelines, along with other measures? He's talking out of both sides of his mouth at this point, Mark Carney, and I think Canadians will see that.
Well, the Liberals do say that you can still build pipelines even without repealing C-69 because there is a substitution option in the legislation to harmonize it and go with provincial approval processes. So like that remains to be seen, right? But
Hear him say it.
Well, I mean, he did, and this is why I followed up to get clarity. But yes, I understand. But when you talk about cutting red tape and regulations, that also means cutting all the environmental policies, right? Like
No.
Carbon pricing is going to go away, emissions caps are going to go away. We don't know if he's going to have even an emissions target, whether he'll try to meet, the international commitment. So how do you think that is playing in this campaign?
Today, Poilievre was out talking about that, and he was talking about the problem of duplicating environmental assessments on projects. He said he will not get rid of those environmental assessments. He just wants to make sure that we do it once and we do it right. And so just going back to his cutting of the red tape and the regulation around resource development, we are at a time, a critical time, where we either need to make it or break it with our economy. We have an unforeseen threat from our closest ally. We need to reshift, and this is something that Mark Carney has talked about as well. But Pierre Poilievre is the one in this race that is talking about those resource development projects, and I think that that's resonating, especially here in northern British Columbia.
Yeah, Rob, I know they're going to stick with environmental assessments, and the goal of everybody seems to be, or at least the two leading parties, is to have it happening all at once, so you don't have, multiple processes. But I've not heard anything on emissions targets. And sticking with international commitments, it is like, let's go, 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 go. So like, is that just all set aside now, or do you think voters are still going to want some sort of a balance?
Yes. I mean, Mr. Carney did make some environmental announcements today about national parks, but he's campaigning against Donald Trump. He has borrowed the playbook of Doug Ford. He's not spending much time in the United States, but he's campaigning against Donald Trump. And Mr. Poilievre is still playing some defense. You know what struck me about today and yesterday in Mr. Poilievre's sort of stagecraft? Look at the podium art. There's no Canada First anymore.
Yeah.
It's just a red maple leaf on a blue background. That tells you that we don't call it pivot, we call it an evolution. But the evolution is continuing. And I was quite struck by that. He has to acknowledge that Mr. Trump is a menace because he is. He continues, though, to campaign on issues that he believes will make him stronger. But they're issues, I'm not sure they're issues that are going to be about addition. I'm not sure that he is going to enlarge his voter pool. And that podium art tells me that he's worried about subtraction still.
Yeah, Jordan, the new three were still going to ditch the slogans, it seems like, because they have not had it on the podium for a number of days. But, Poilievre is talking about growth through the energy sector, and Mark Carney's talking about a similar sort of thing. We're not seeing a real growth argument coming from the NDP. When people are concerned about economic resilience, building up the economy, it's more of a redistribution and supports. I mean, do we expect to see them get in on this?
Well, I expect you're going to see more from the NDP on that question because they tend to wrap it up in some of their announcements as well. Today's is a good example on housing. So they're talking about making those investments in community housing construction. That would employ 100,000 Canadian workers. That would use Canadian aluminum and steel. So there's a lot of opportunities there that are wrapped up in some of those announcements. But they are forefronting things like affordability, housing, healthcare, and standing up for workers. So those are the core themes I think you're going to see the campaign return to again and again because those are NDP brand strengths and those are areas where Singh and the NDP team can point to some real victories that they had over the last couple of years.
Jana, how do you see this fight going over resource development, pipelines, mega projects? Because Carney has laid out the sort of policy beginning with the First Minister's meeting that they had a couple of Fridays ago that we probably never would have seen from a Prime Minister Trudeau, moves very much towards what Pierre Poilievre has been talking about over multiple election cycles. I mean, will voters find that credible coming from a Liberal government that was very seized with an environmental agenda for the past 10 years?
Well, I mean, he has talked about these things, an energy corridor. He's talked about getting rid of the red tape. Today asked a question specifically about pipelines and in Quebec. And he said, yes, we only need one environmental assessment. And I'm perfectly fine with Quebec's. It's pretty high standard. So why do we need two? So he's moving the Liberals much more towards the center on that. And then the question if the policies aren't massively different when it comes to resource development, the question is, who do you find more credible? And, you know, I'm sure Rachel will say it's Pierre Poilievre. I'm going to say it's Mark Carney. Where are voters going? Who do they think is the guy who can get things done? And again, I think I've harped on this a bit, but at the end of the day, it's a guy who's done things in life, who's delivered results, versus a guy who's a career politician who's never really had any serious responsibility, and he has very little results to point to. Here's what I've done. Here's what I've accomplished. Here's how I can do this again. You know, people work by analogy very often. Mark Carney has a list of things he's accomplished, and Pierre Poilievre just doesn't. So, well, Rachel, respond to that. Like, I'm not one of these people who automatically thinks a career politician is a bad thing. Politics is a profession. People go into it. But, you know, you do want to stack up accomplishments, you know, after a lifetime in it. I mean, how do you push back against that argument from the Liberals? Because, you know, they do this all the time. Mark Carney's done X, Y, and Z. Pierre Poilievre's just been, you know, an MP.
Yeah, and the thing is, like, ask the average Canadian to name 3 things about Mark Carney. Other than he was the governor of the Bank of Canada, they probably can't tell you anything or any policies that he's really pushing, because we haven't really seen Mark Carney over the last few weeks. He was out today with a policy. It was about parks. And so I think that eventually it's all nice to have all these people talking about Mark Carney and his economic experience, and that's great. But let's get Mark Carney out there talking about real policies. Let's get Mark Carney out there every day announcing something for Canadians instead of being in Ottawa or being down for the day and trying to just sit out this campaign. I think what's starting to really irritate me is the fact that the Liberal campaign seems to be hiding him almost so that he doesn't go up or down in the polls. He kind of just coasts through. And I think eventually Canadians are going to be able to juxtapose that, especially after the debate, where they're going to be debating really hard policies between him and Pierre Poilievre. Because, you know, it's one thing to have been the Bank of Canada governor. It's another thing to be a legislator. And Pierre Poilievre has been a legislator and knows these policies and the history of Canada better than most people. And I would take him in a betting race any day when it comes to being able to understand that policy in terms of Canada's need for the next 10 years.
Well, Rob, I'm also not the type of guy who's going to denigrate someone who's a central banker, because that's also a pretty rarefied air, along with being a member of Parliament. Do you think, Rob, that they're kind of hiding Mark Carney? Because, like, when he's been in Ottawa, it's been like first ministers meeting and cabinet ministers, you know, cabinet meetings to deal with the U.S. But, you know, he takes a lot more questions than Pierre Poilievre. It takes 4, no follow-ups. You know, he takes about 20 minutes. I mean, do you think he's hiding? Because there's always a bit of a bubble around a front-runner, but there's also a bubble around the challenger here, in that a very limited exposure to questions and no follow-ups, you know, as we enter week 3 of the campaign.
No, I do think Canadians are projecting a great deal on Mr. Carney. I don't think they know him intimately yet. But no, I watched him on Cinq Chefs last week, where he was on for 20 minutes and where his performance in French was the subject of a great deal of analysis for a couple of days afterwards. He isn't hiding. I think what he needs to be careful of is to stay on brand, and his brand is sepulchral at times, blunt at times, and it isn't a quipster, which is where he was at last night. So no, I don't think he's been hiding. And if you're asking me as a journalist, as somebody who was trying to get all of the campaigns, I like the notion that you're allowed to ask a question, ask a follow-up of a political leader. I don't like the notion that you're not allowed to ask a follow-up question of a political leader. That questions are usually restricted to 4 or 5, and that aides are running around trying to determine the nature of your question and who's going to ask it, which is the case with Mr. Poilievre. I think that he's probably the most polished performer when it comes to communications that Canada's had, maybe since Brian Mulroney. Why they need to have him wrapped up that way is a mystery to me, because the guy is very, very sure-footed normally.
Yeah, it leads to some weird moments, too, like where a 20-something political staffer's putting hands on people on a wharf in Petty Harbor and things like that. Jono, your quick thoughts on that, and then Jordan on the bubble issues.
Yeah, look, I don't think that Mark Carney is hiding from media. He's answering questions. He's not great at it because he's not a politician. He's not a career politician, and he fumbles sometimes through his answers because he's a banker. He's not a politician. It would be nice if Pierre Poilievre was a bit more comfortable, not having people control what the questions are, suggesting strongly to media what their questions should be, and if not, maybe they won't get a question. I don't know how it's being perceived or where people are watching it, but if you're watching, he seems to try to take those 4 questions, no follow-ups, and run out the clock, where he gives you his 30-second answer and then 4 minutes of his greatest hits. So I think he's doing the Canadian voters a disservice by not being just more out there. He can go run around the country and have rallies with thousands of people, and that's great. It's great engagement, but to be afraid of answering media questions, to me, is unfortunate.
Jordan, though, Mark Carney does take more questions every day on the campaign. He's only done one national English interview, I think, though, since seeking the leadership, and we're months into that now. I don't think they're the same in terms of access, but it's not sort of a Trudeau level of access with the Liberal leader.
Sure, and that's obviously very intentional, and I think a big part of that is that Mark Carney is at his very best when there's a bit of mystery still around him. That's part of the allure that Canadians are having right now. And he is less sure-footed in his question and answer. That has been the most uneven part of his performance that we've seen over the last 2 weeks. So it makes sense that his team wants to minimize that. And I think it also makes sense that his team wants to maximize opportunities for him to appear as the Prime Minister. That's good strategy. Now, the Conservative campaign is really going to unprecedented lengths to limit journalists' access for somebody who I would argue is actually quite capable of answering questions, which I think is actually, it's very unfortunate because it is limiting scrutiny to a degree, and the question, he's not being exposed to sort of the full barrage of questions that he might get otherwise. But I wonder also if some of that is about concern that he might give in to temptation to argue with reporters. And to sort of take off the veneer of the nicer Pierre Poilievre that we've seen over the last couple of weeks, because that's a very new addition to his repertoire. So there is a danger there, I think, for him. And, for all of the talk of Pierre Poilievre's performance in debates, he is a very good debater. But the point of debates is not to win by wiping the floor with your opponent. The point of the debates is to appeal to the people who are listening and to the voters who are hearing you. And I think that there's a real danger there that he may get lost in wanting to win and in doing so actually lose.
Yeah, it's a stage to demonstrate temperament,
That's
character,
right.
these sorts of things, and reassure people who are, thinking about it. So, we'll see. Rob mentioned people are projecting things, and that includes China when it comes to Mark Carney, because federal officials are warning of a disinformation campaign taking place on the Chinese social media platform WeChat. They say the content contains false stories about Liberal leader Mark Carney. It was uncovered by a special election task force set up to look into security and intelligence threats.
This information operation had contrasting positive and negative narratives, first amplifying Mr. Carney's stance with the United States and then targeting his experience and credentials. The site task force assesses that the foreign state-backed information operation was intended to influence Canadian Chinese communities and look to mold perceptions about the candidate.
Okay, well, Rob, some of those perceptions were very positive headlines about Mark Carney, right? Rock star banker, strong PM to deal with the U.S. There were some others that were more critical, but the ones that have really sort of surfaced in this, it's feeding the, China likes the Liberal sort of social media arguments. What do you make of what we saw today from this?
Yeah, on balance, it looks like they were trying to put a thumb on the scale for the Liberals and for Mark Carney. We should all be concerned about that. Everybody should be concerned about that. I've seen no evidence that he sought their backing. We all know that he was in China last year as part of a delegation of financiers, and that he met with President Xi. But this is something that should concern all of us. And I do like the close to real time information that site is giving us as this is going on. I think that this is very, very helpful and very useful, and a good reminder to all of us in Canada that there are lots of people out there who don't wish us well. They're not just in Washington, D.C. now. They're everywhere, and we should be concerned about that, and we should ask some tough questions of our leaders.
Yeah, Rachel, I wonder what you make of this. Like Rob's point there that the near real-time notification of this. Remember, like, because this seems to me it's a little bit like the Kenny Chu situation from 2019, I think it was, where they couldn't quantify, didn't know if it was really going to have an effect, so they stayed quiet on it. The threshold has changed, and they're getting it out there, and this feels like progress in terms of building resilience within the community.
Yes, and I will, by no surprise, give the Conservatives a big shout out for pushing the need for an inquiry on foreign interference for many years. And now we're seeing the outcome of what that system looks like. And so I just will echo what Rob's saying. This is scary stuff that's happening. It's not a good look for Canadian elections. They have said it won't make an impact, which is good. But, you know, we're talking a lot about the threat of Trump in this campaign. We also maybe have to look at the threat of China in this campaign as well. And so now I think today a lot of Canadians shifted their thinking a little bit and back to that foreign interference piece and are really crossing their fingers that we don't see bigger issues coming up over the next 3 weeks.
Jordan, what are your thoughts on this? I mean, I'm seeing a lot of social media noise about this is further sign of Mark Carney being beholden to China. People talking about that loan he got for the building in Shanghai. It's a $250 million loan. That's not a personal loan. It's for the company, which has $1 trillion in assets. So you can do the math there. I don't know if that constitutes leverage. But here it is, a pro-Carney move linked to China in the middle of the election.
I think the most important thing to remember about foreign interference is that most of it is designed to erode trust in democracy. And so I am actually really heartened to see that we're getting these more regular and transparent reports about what's happening as the election is unfolding. I think that's a really important piece for reassuring Canadians that our government, nonpartisan, is on this and is monitoring what's going on and informing Canadians about the source of these threats. You know, there's always going to be accusations going one way or the other about that type of thing. But it is my hope in this campaign that all the parties will come out and really speak in a way that reinforces the integrity of our electoral system, right, rather than putting it into doubt, because that's really what the folks who are engaged in this interference are looking for.
Well, Jono, that's really the challenge here, right? Because this is done to erode trust. And already you see people going, aha! I knew he was in the bag for China, as opposed to looking at it and saying, okay, there's a lot of bad actors out there and bad information. You know, we should be judicious in what we see, what we share, and what we repeat, right?
Right. Well, so instead of helping Carney, it's now hurting Carney. So yeah. Again, I don't know that it's really the goal is to help him. It's not the first case during this campaign. We've seen it with India in certain leadership campaigns or candidates who have been removed. I would be remiss if I didn't remind everyone that there's a political leader who refuses to get a security clearance, that he could find out about maybe some things that would be happening in his party. I think Pierre Poilievre does his own party a disservice by not taking that opportunity to get it. It's not a matter of muzzling him. I think that's been debunked. It's about protecting the integrity of the election. But at the end of the day, we know they're bad actors. We know they're going to continue. I'm glad that SITE announced this. I hope this gets full media coverage, not just in mainstream media, but in community media, where they're able to see that they're being fed misinformation. And I think that's the key, that this is one, but for 3 more weeks of the campaign, I'd be surprised if this was the last time this happened. And so continue to let us know. Please do. I think it benefits all of us.
Rachel, what's your sense on the ground in British Columbia about the approach to this? Because there's an acute vulnerability, with a large, Chinese diaspora community, in particular in the lower mainland of British Columbia, and of course in like Markham and parts of the GTA. What's your sense of how this is being perceived on the West Coast there?
Well, I think we're always conscious of it out here. I think Kenny Chu raised a lot of flags in the previous election, and things that we saw ultimately come out to have evidence behind. And so I think there is a definite awareness, and I think that the Chinese community is an amazing addition to this province. They are very involved in elections, and they are great, volunteers and supporters. And so it's important that we have that level of accountability. And again, this is something that Liberals dragged their feet on in Ottawa, to have an inquiry into this. And the Conservatives really pushed, and hopefully now we will see support from all parties as we see these results come out and this get better throughout this campaign. But I think British Columbia is no different than, like you noted, Ontario when it comes to the Chinese community.
And different settlement patterns and different critical mass of people from certain communities. Rob, I just wonder how you think, as a final point, how this is going to be perceived in that kind of double-edged sword of drawing the attention to it. The people will say, aha, I told you something was up, versus, it reinforcing the need to be critical and skeptical and go to trusted sources on things.
What I think people should take away from this, given that Canada did have an open inquiry into this, that it was taken seriously and looked at, given that we have SITE now that is reporting in near real time, we have a democracy that's worth defending. We have been reminded of that, given the threat from Donald Trump. But this gives us another reason to actually embrace the fact that we have a democracy that's worth defending. And you look, for instance, at the people who have a serious chance of being prime minister. There's really very, very little daylight between them on how they would deal with Mr. Trump. They both see him as a menace. And I think it's fair to think that they would all see this as threatening behavior as well. And Canadians should be, I think, proud of their democracy and proud of the fact that it's worth defending.
Okay. We'll leave it there with 3 weeks to go. I want to thank the Power Panel for being here. Rob Russo, Rachel Siegel, Jonathan Kalis, and Jordan Likeness. Thank you so much, gang. It's good to see you all. There's still lots more to come right here on Power and Politics. Just ahead, as Donald Trump vows to move ahead with tariffs, what are the odds of a global recession? Spoiler alert, high. Plus, the latest on the White House's next move in this trade war. The CBC's Katie Simpson is standing by in Washington, D.C. And the Power Rankings panel is here to talk about the key moments on the campaign trail today. Want to catch up with Power and Politics while you're on the go? Then check out and follow our daily podcast. I'm David Cochran. The Power and Politics podcast starts now, where I speak to the key players in the political stories that everyone is talking about. You can find the latest episode on the CBC Listen app or wherever you get your podcasts. Well, despite the roughly 10 trillion US dollars he's wiped off of the global markets, President Donald Trump is standing by his tariffs today.
It's the only chance our country will have to reset the table, because no other president would be willing to do what I'm doing or to even go through it. Now, I don't mind going through it because I see a beautiful picture at the end.
Well, this was a roller coaster day for the markets as indexes bounced between gains and losses. At close, the Dow Jones was down almost another full percent, while the NASDAQ ticked up 0.1%. So how are analysts at the big U.S. agencies making sense of all this economic chaos? Mark Zandi is the chief economist with Moody's Analytics, and he joins me now. Mark Zandi, welcome to the show. It's good to meet you, sir.
It's so good to meet you. Thanks for having me on.
If these tariffs stay in place and all of the counter tariffs stay in place, what happens to the U.S. economy? What happens to the world economy?
David, brace for impact. That's a pretty dark scenario. I think we go into recession here in the U.S. and globally. I don't know how we would avoid it. I mean, here in the U.S., the tariffs represent a massive tax increase on U.S. consumers and businesses. If you do the arithmetic, it's the largest tax increase since the Vietnam War, when that tax increase was used to finance the war. It hurts consumers. It hurts businesses. Many businesses purchase imported goods to produce whatever it is that they're producing, so it hurts their profitability. Of course, it's nailed the stock market. The stock market kind of did okay today, but it's down 17, 18, 19% from its peak 6 weeks ago. That's a lot of wealth that's been wiped out. And in the U.S., consumer spending is very top heavy. Just give you a statistic. The folks in the top 10% of the income distribution account for nearly half the spending. And of course, it's those well-to-do that own the stock. So stock market down, they get hit. So, it doesn't take a lot of thought to get to the place where this is a pretty dark scenario, both for the U.S. and by extension, Canada and the rest of the world.
How quickly do you think that recession comes? Because, we heard comments from Larry Fink, the CEO of BlackRock, I think it was today, when he said that, most CEOs he talked to would say the U.S. is already in a recession. What's your sense of when it hits sort of the technical definition here?
Yeah, I'm an economist, so I stick to the numbers. And the key statistic here is jobs, employment. Once you go from positive employment to negative, losing jobs, that's the demarcation between recession and no recession. We're not there yet. We got the March employment data last week, looked okay. Of course, that's in the rearview mirror. But if you look forward, I do think we will see job growth slow. And, if I had to pick a month, given all the things that are kind of unfolding here, and the president doesn't find an off-ramp, for these tariffs, I suspect by June, July, in that period, we'll see some negative job numbers. And when the academics sit down and date this recession, it will be, June or July 2025.
Okay, so China's retaliated, Canada's retaliated, Europe has put retaliatory measures on the table. China's retaliated at 34% tariffs. Trump threatened today to go up by an additional 50% on China, going well over 104% if he does it. I mean, what does that do to your outlook here? I mean, if it goes to those levels, it feels like all bets are off.
Yeah, that's part of why recession risks are as high as they are. Even if the president kind of finds a way to backtrack on some of the tariff increases on other countries, the fact that the U.S. is going at it with the Chinese, the two largest economies on the planet by orders of magnitude, is really not a good place to be. And it doesn't feel like anyone's going to back down here. It feels like a global game of chicken. And I don't know how that plays out. It just doesn't feel good. And if both countries keep raising their tariffs tit for tat, we're going to end up with very little trade between the two countries, and the fallout from that is just going to be very difficult to overcome. So, that actually, David, the fact that the Chinese have retaliated in kind, and now that the president is upping the ante, is maybe the thing that made me most worried today. The piece of information that I feel most uncomfortable with coming out of today's action.
So despite what history tells us about the effect tariffs have on economies, despite what the markets are saying, despite what other countries are saying, despite what the economists are saying, the president and his cabinet are talking about an upside. The Treasury Secretary saying you can build long-term economic fundamentals for prosperity by bringing back manufacturing, and that a bunch of countries have reached out trying to renegotiate trade barriers. I mean, do you see this upside in the plan that the White House is claiming?
I don't. I'm perplexed by it. I mean, I'm just an example. Put yourself in the shoes of a CEO of a major, say, global vehicle manufacturing company. You're trying to decide what to do with these tariffs. Should you invest in the United States? And then you ask yourself, what are the tariffs going to be tomorrow? What are they going to be a month from now? What are they going to be 3 years from now when if I build a plant, it's going to be finished? It takes 3-4 years to build a vehicle plant. And what about 10, 20 years from now? Because these plants have that long a life. And the answer is, I have no idea. I don't really know. These tariffs are done under executive order. They can be changed with the stroke of a pen, And are they legal? Who knows that? I mean, they're going to be challenged and already being challenged in the courts. That's going to take a long time to figure out, but it'll ultimately be adjudicated maybe a year, 18 months, 24 months from now, and they may go all completely away. So would you actually make a big investment in the United States, given the uncertainty around these tariffs? I just don't get it. I don't see it. And by the way, David, think about it for another 3 seconds. Suppose you do get some investment here. If you look at U.S. manufacturing, it's 10% of the job base. In a good year, it creates 10, 20, 30,000 jobs. Maybe in a fantastic year, it'd be 100,000 jobs, but that's nothing, in the context of the American economy. It needs to create 1 million, 1.5 million every single year. So I'm perplexed by it. I'm confused by the whole thing.
I mean, would America even have the labor pool to work in factories of the magnitude and scale that they're talking about? And with the goods they produce, having to pay an American wage, I mean, would they even be affordable for the Americans, even inside a tariff wall? If you look what it does to garments, if you look what it would do to an iPhone, it seems like you're turning reasonably affordable goods into massively expensive luxury items if you get what you want out of this plan. Well,
here's the irony in all that. You would need more immigration, right? I mean, because the domestic population is, like in much of the rest of the world, declining. Everyone's like me. I'm a baby boomer. Approaching retirement very quickly. Not that I'm going to retire, David, but I'm just.
Well, not now. Not with the markets the way they are.
Exactly. I got a lot of work to do. Yeah. But the demographics here are pretty obvious, pretty compelling. So if you want, to bring a lot of workers back here, a lot of jobs back here, you need a lot of workers. You need more immigration. But of all the things to be concerned about at this point, I think that's at the bottom of the list. At the top of the list is. What's the problem we're addressing here? What is it that we're trying to fix? And bringing manufacturing back here certainly can't be, the objective here, because, that's not going to happen. And even if it did, it's not going to create a lot of jobs.
If I can ask you just about the markets, right? Like they were down really pretty badly since inauguration, down quite poorly since Liberation Day, as the president calls it. Very mixed today. Last week, I spoke to a Republican congressman named Chuck Edwards from North Carolina. This was after trillions have been lost on the market. He said investors were being emotional, Canada was being emotional, companies were being emotional. We saw the NASDAQ up a little bit today. I mean, are people being emotional? I mean, have the markets just recalibrated to this new reality, or what conclusion can we draw from what we saw today?
Well, there's a reality here. We're in the middle of a global trade war. That's as I said, that's a massive tax increase. That's real dollars and cents that people are going to pay. Here's a statistic. If all those tariffs that have been announced are actually implemented, the typical American household will have to spend $2,100 more a year to buy the same goods as they are today. And for lower middle income households, that can't save anything, they don't have any kind of cash cushion or savings, that's a lot of money. They got it. I got to make some hard choices there. What do I do with that? What bill am I not going to pay? What credit card am I going to use? And so, very significant effects here, real consequential effects. And let's not discount emotion. Emotion matters. At the end of the day, a recession is a loss of faith. Consumers lose faith that they're going to be able to hold on to their job. Businesses lose faith that they're going to be able to sell whatever they produce. It's a psychological event. And, we're right on the precipice here of pushing that collective psyche over the cliff. And once consumers start to pull back and businesses follow, we're done. We're in the rabbit hole. We're going into recession.
Okay, so just as a final point, Mark Zandi, with everyone's collective psyche on the edge of that cliff, I mean, what are you watching for tomorrow and the next couple of days to get a sense of where this is going? Because we've seen, Israel dropped all the tariffs. Trump kind of shrugged and didn't, respond in kind. I mean, what are you watching for in terms of the markets and the administration in terms of where this is going to go?
We need an off-ramp. the president, the administration has to figure out how to de-escalate this, bring those tariffs back in, and not engage in kind of tit for tat, conflict with other trading partners. That's just not going to work. So hopefully he finds that the administration finds that off ramp here pretty soon. But I'll say, David, it has to happen pretty soon, because if it does in the next week, 2 or 3, I'm afraid we're off the cliff, and we're in that self-reinforcing negative cycle called a recession, and there's no going back.
It feels like they're in a cul-de-sac right now. They're in. It sure does, right? It's closed off, and they're not changing direction at all.
Yep.
Well, Mark Zandi, thank you. We appreciate the analysis, and let's hope we avoid that cliff. Thanks for being here today, sir.
Yeah, anytime. Take care now.
Well, as many countries like Canada retaliate against U.S. tariffs, one country is promising to capitulate to President Donald Trump's demands. That story is next. U.S. President Donald Trump is resisting calls to pause his reciprocal tariffs on 185 countries. Here is Trump speaking today from the White House.
We're going to have one shot at this. And no other president's going to do this, what I'm doing. And I'll tell you what, it's an honor to do it because we have been just destroyed, what they've done to our system. You know, we have $36 trillion of debt for a reason. And the reason is that people allowed it to get that way. So we'll be talking to China. We'll be talking to a lot of different countries. And I think, you know, if we can make a really fair deal and a good deal for the United States, not a good deal for others. This is America first. It's now America first.
Trump says he's open to negotiate with countries, but he's also threatening to impose even more tariffs against China. The CBC's Katie Simpson joins us now from Washington. So, Katie, bring us up to speed on this latest threat to Beijing.
Yeah, so this is really the headline from today, aside from all of the volatility around the stock market and investor jitters. It's that Donald Trump has come forward to say he is going to hit China with a new 50% tariff on top of the tariffs he's already imposed or planning to impose on China. This is because China has responded to U.S. tariffs with retaliatory tariffs. It has decided to impose a 34% tariff on U.S. goods. Donald Trump didn't like that. And as he was rolling out this tariff plan, he has long said that if a country dares to retaliate, that the U.S. reserves the right to respond even harder. And so that's what this is about from Washington and the Trump administration. So if you add all of the tariffs up that the Trump administration is proposing to hit China with, it would total 104% on a country that ships hundreds of billions of dollars worth of goods to the United States every year. It's about $400 billion or so. And so Trump says he's going to go forward with it unless China is willing to get rid of its retaliatory tariffs by tomorrow. So the stakes are high, things are moving quickly, and he is vowing to sort of push ahead. It has been an erratic weekend of trade policy from the Trump administration with a wide range of different views, mixed messages about what is actually going on behind the scenes within the Trump administration. Some advisors saying Donald Trump is not open to negotiating, that this is going ahead, this is a national emergency because more goods need to be produced in the United States. Others have sort of celebrated Donald Trump's power grab, bragging about his negotiation skills and giving the United States the most leverage in this moment. Donald Trump seems to be leaning towards the leverage argument from members of his administration, but again, sort of offering more confusing messaging. So today in the White House, he was asked, you know, whether tariffs are going to be permanent or whether he's open to negotiation. And here's what he said about that.
They can both be true. There can be permanent tariffs, and there can also be negotiations because there are things that we need beyond tariffs.
So how does a country determine whether they are going to be a part of the permanent tariff club or the negotiation tariff club, the pink pony club, as they're calling it down here in Washington, D.C.? Gotta have a little levity in there, David. Gotta have a little levity in there. So yeah, at this moment, that is what countries are trying to deal with as they try to figure out if they're going to be hit with these absolutely devastating economic consequences.
Okay, so I don't know if Benjamin Netanyahu's in the Pink Pony Club or not, but he was in the Oval Office today. You know, the Israeli Prime Minister was there, and Israel it's not taking the China approach to dealing with Trump and tariffs. Like they are saying we're going to get rid of everything is the way Bibi's approached this.
Yeah, I think this is the first time that there's been a Pink Pony Club reference on Power and Politics.
Yeah, I think so.
Yeah, so there are a number of different approaches world leaders are taking. China is retaliating. Canada has retaliated as well, but we're going to get to that in just a second. So you've got China on one hand responding and how Donald Trump is reacting there. Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu came to the White House. He's the first world leader to get an audience at the Oval Office since these new tariffs were announced. And he made his case to Trump directly and to the public, saying, listen to what he had to say.
We will eliminate the trade deficit with the United States. We intend to do it very quickly. We think it's the right thing to do. And we're going to also eliminate trade barriers, a variety of trade barriers that have been put up unnecessarily. And I think Israel can serve as a model for many countries who ought to do the same.
So he is trying to speak Trump's language, talking about barriers that make it more difficult for American companies to compete in foreign markets, getting rid of policies that the American government doesn't like and think is unfair to American businesses and workers. Those are the kinds of things he promised. But Trump was asked directly if he was going to, reduce the tariffs that he's proposed for Israel, a strong American ally that Donald Trump has increased support to Israel since he returned to office, particularly through the war effort. And he wouldn't give a committal answer today on whether Israel's efforts when it comes to trade are going to get Israel sort of away from Trump's tariffs. So there are many different approaches that world leaders are taking. They're all looking at the way Trump is responding to the sort of the different lanes everyone is taking, and really considering taking it all into consideration as they present how they're going to respond going forward.
It's remarkable, though, Katie, just on that even if you give him exactly what he says he wants, there's no guarantee. Right? That it gets you out from under this. Like, there doesn't seem to be an appeasement level you can get to that guarantees the pain goes away. And this is the problem in dealing with it right now.
It's the problem in trying to get into the Pink Pony Club.
Yes, exactly. If we want
is that what we're gonna call it now? It's like, if you're able to escape tariffs, you've made it to the Pink Pony Club.
I got to figure out what a Pink Pony Club is, but
I sent you an email.
We'll discuss. Okay, all right, Katie. Thank you so much. This is CBC's Katie Simpson in Washington, D.C. All right, the Power Rankings panel is going to be here to talk about the key moments on the campaign trail today. That's coming up next. right, welcome back. It's time for our daily power rankings, our look at who is up and who is down on Canada's political stage. I'm joined by Amanda Galbraith, who is a former advisor to Prime Minister Stephen Harper. Cheryl Oates was Director of Communications for former Alberta NDP Premier Rachel Notley. And here with me in the studio is Karleen Verheyen, is a three-time Liberal War Room spokesperson on past campaigns. Well, welcome to day 16 of the federal election campaign. And today, the main party leaders were reacting to what else? Market chaos caused by Donald Trump's tariffs.
This chaos is the direct result of wrong-headed, unnecessary, chaotic policies coming from President Trump.
Disrupting the global economy, global financial markets, by directly targeting Canadian workers and by fundamentally reshaping the international trading system.
With the uncertainty in the States and how that's impacting workers in Canada, we actually need to invest in our country.
So after a roller coaster day in the markets, President Trump is sticking to his tariff plan. Amanda, perhaps no surprise there that Donald Trump is not backing down in the face of all the evidence, but this is your topic that you wanted to highlight today.
Yeah, my topic is, I think, the big news story of certainly last week and this week, which is, markets are down, down, down. It is greatly impacting everybody's lives. And I know we're here to kind of trade punches around politics. And I think that's an important thing for us to talk about, the choice before folks. But, at the end of the day, this is people's retirement. This is people's savings. This is whether or not folks have jobs. A bit bigger than just sort of the vagaries of the day-to-day of an election. And also, interesting today too as well, right? That sort of false hope balloon, that trial balloon, who knows what it was, where it said, oh, he may pause them for 90 days, except for on China. Markets went right back up again for a little bit, and then they went down. So again, it speaks to, I think, a lack of discipline from that administration. And I think the challenges we're going to face as a country broadly over the next several years.
Cheryl, the tariffs have wiped out $10 trillion in stock market wealth to solve a trade deficit of $1 trillion. And, none of it adds up. But here we all are getting battered by it. What are your thoughts on this one?
Yeah, in terms of the impact on the Canadian election right now, obviously, the top of mind question was who's going to take on Donald Trump and who's going to deal with the implications of the administration strategy. And I think this just really underlines that. And it's really tough for politicians like Poilievre, who have built his campaign around a narrative where there is one really clear villain, which has been Justin Trudeau and the Liberals. And in this current situation, especially when you look at Canada's economic fundamentals compared to other places in the world right now, that is a really, really tough story to tell and a tough pivot to make. So certainly, the question remains the same, but maybe the implications much more dire as we see the impact in the stock markets.
Karleen, how do you see this one?
If you're privileged enough to have some savings in a retirement account, you probably don't want to be looking at that account today. It's hard to underscore how much I think this has really undone any sigh of relief or sense of respite that Canadians may have felt last week on Liberation Day, when we were all sitting around thinking, Are we really not on that list? Did they really leave us out? And you did see some people in the country scramble to call that good news. But I think what we saw today is a reminder that most likely the path that we're on for the foreseeable future is agent of chaos, ratchets things up. We get to a milestone mark where there's a decision that he may or may not make. Perhaps we kick the can down the road, but we can never really fully be off of the edge of our seats. And so what Canadians, I think, want to hear from the people who are auditioning for the role of leader of the country is probably, what's your plan for dealing with that in the long term? Because that's likely to be where we are for the next 4 years.
Yeah, you go back to Wednesday. It was Wednesday, right? That's Liberation Day. You can see how some people might at first blush say, oh, this is good news because we're not on that. But then we saw the knock-on effects of the tariffs that have previously been announced, and you kind of forget about them unless you're in the industry and in the sector that's directly affected, like the auto sector, with what we're seeing. Well, Amanda, down your way, where you're from, right, in southwestern Ontario, with Stellantis and everything, doing this temporary, I say in air quotes, because we don't know what this means and what the contagion might be for other parts of that industry over the coming days. But, politically, I wonder, does this all just lock in the ballot question? that this is all about Trump. I mean, do you see it that way, Amanda? I know there's a bunch of other issues people vote on, but this is the one that seems to have moved the critical mass of voters, or is moving the critical mass of voters. Does this just lock it in for the rest of this campaign?
I certainly think it's the $100 bazillion question of the next 3 weeks for all. Actually, David Coletto of Abacus Data had a really interesting piece on Substack today where he looked at sort of 3 different voter blocks: the over 50s, the boomers, the elder millennial folks such as myself, sub 50s, and then much younger generations, how they consume media. And I do think for the over 50s, yeah, this is absolutely locked in as the ballot box question. I do think for folks under 40, though, cost of living, and that's what I've seen, you can see across different polls, that is neck and neck, if not as prominent, right? Will I be able to buy a house? All those sorts of things. They don't see Donald Trump's threat to their retirement as existential. So I certainly think, is he still the big gorilla in the room that all the campaigns have to account for and campaign against to a certain extent? Yes, absolutely. But is he the only game in town, especially for certain voter blocks? No.
Yeah, Cheryl, there's definitely a bit of a generational divide here, but I mean, Trump's going to make it a lot harder to build and buy houses too, right? It's not just RRSPs and investment portfolios that are getting sideswiped by this. It's the whole economy. I mean, what are your thoughts on what this does to the central focus of the campaign?
There has been sort of 2 narratives of this campaign, 2 questions that voters have been grappling with. One, of course, is who's best to take on Donald Trump, and the other side has been affordability. Who is the best leader that's going to, make your bills cheaper or make it easier for you to buy a house? And it's hard to imagine that those 2 questions are not the same question at this point. Like, we're talking about the risk of heading into a global recession where, there's fewer jobs, there's lower wages, it's harder to buy a house. I can't imagine that even for young people, if their top of mind was like, for example, the carbon tax and its impact on their bank accounts, that their mind is not now turning to how is the U.S. administration impacting my ability to do all the things that I dreamed of in the years ahead for me. So I know we've sort of been looking at them as 2 different questions, but in these current circumstances, to me, they're the same question.
Yeah, I don't know if it's completely displacement, but Carly, there's probably a whole lot of overlap and intersection on what were 2 separate issues at the beginning of this, perhaps.
They were perhaps separate at one point, but Cheryl has hit on something interesting that I think I've been observing over the last number of weeks, which is that traditionally in Canadian politics and around the world, conservatives, like small c conservatives, kind of totally own the management of the economy issue. That was one of their advantages. With the rise in populist right-wing politicians like Donald Trump, and I think for a while it was the way that Pierre Poilievre presented himself, although perhaps a little bit less now, that has kind of been shredded. So if you are a Canadian Conservative Party struggling to find your footing now in this environment, that is why. You see people like Donald Trump that have taken $10 trillion out of the stock market in a single day because of a focus on measures that are being driven by whatever, we all want to read the tea leaves are his motivation. I think it's creating a challenge for, as I said, any Conservative Party in a Canadian election or probably in any other Western democracy to really put their front foot forward on issues of the economy.
There's a weird shift happening too, where incumbency was a disadvantage and now it's becoming an asset because of the way Trump has changed things. And I'm curious to see how that shakes out for the, what was going to be a change election now is also about stability. So Carlene, let's get to your point. You want to talk about Mark Carney with a policy aimed at older voters, Amanda. Imagine that. Go ahead, Carlene. What do you got there?
Well, and it is interesting. I think that this was politically smart for 2 reasons, and I'll get into that in a second. But just to back up, so Mark Carney was in Victoria, British Columbia today. I think the slogan that they don't put on their license plates is for the newlywed and the nearly dead. Yeah. Very, popular community for retired people. But he was making an announcement that was focused on seniors because I think it is important to remember, as we think about a day like today, that it's not just auto plant workers and steel workers who are really hurting from the Trump tariffs and the turmoil that's been caused by that, although they certainly are. It's also people who are on a fixed income, whose whatever they have left to live on now that they've stopped working is potentially disintegrating before their eyes. So
with little runway and no working years to recover
exactly.
it, right? Yeah.
So what Carney announced today was a few flexibilities that will allow people, for example, to have to withdraw a little bit less this year or a lot less if they need to leave it in there to watch things hopefully bounce back so that they're not punished for taking money out of a retirement income fund. Some increases to the GIS, which is more for lower income seniors. This isn't sexy headline grabbing stuff, but I think it is the reason that Mark Carney is performing so well in this election is that you've got these agents of chaos around the world turning the global economy upside down. People are looking for stability and a sign that someone has a plan to get us through this. And for a guy who has some experience managing crises, I think he's doing a good job of showing Canadians how he would handle this.
Well, these are also things, Amanda, he can do because he is the Prime Minister and he can, put on that role in the middle of the campaign, though Pierre Poilievre did have a policy on allowing you to keep your money in an RSP for 2 additional years before you have to draw it down through a RIF, to help it grow a little bit to give people a chance to come back. What do you make of the seniors' play here?
The Conservatives once again welcome Mark Carney to our policy platforms. Like he announced it a little while ago, and they're here at the party now. That's great. I think it's a good idea, no matter what, and I'm not surprised that they continue to make a play for boomers and seniors because that is the voters that are migrating their way. It's smart politics. I do candidly just want to take a little bit of exception to Carlene's assertion that Conservatives can no longer position themselves as defenders or in any way an edge on the economy. That is insane to me, given the record of the Liberal government, which has had record deficits, overspending. The budget will balance itself over the last 3 terms. So, no, I don't think all of a sudden this 11th hour conversion to all of a sudden we are economists is going to be changing Canadians' minds about how Liberals manage the economy.
In terms of where they're
no, public opinion is very interested, and I think Mark Carney, because you guys hide him behind whatever, and they're just campaigning on his resume sounds great, but the reality of what he may or may not be as PM is a very different thing. We haven't really had an opportunity to vet him, and he continues not to be fulsomely vetted in my mind. But I don't think that Conservatives at any stretch of the imagination have ceded a single piece of ground on economic management, nor has Pierre Poilievre around how that's happened. If anything, you could argue it's a dead heat. But this is not advantage Liberal, and I think that's an important context for folks to have.
Well, Cheryl, this came up earlier. Rachel Siegel made this point on the Power panel. Do you think they're hiding Mark Carney? I don't know. I mean, he takes a pile of questions every day, and he's out there. I mean, neither one of the leaders is doing the Trudeau-style 400 events a day campaign. But Carney is, ask your questions, let's go. I mean, is he hidden? Do you think he's not being vetted enough? I'm curious what you think.
No, I think this is how most political campaigns assess risk these days, which is to say, what is the most little amount we can do, or the littlest risk we can take, which is unscripted questions, unscripted answers, and get away with, not hiding the candidate. And truthfully, in this era of 24-hour news cycles, you don't have to do a million events. Like, it's not all about doing public events all the time. Some of it's smaller events, some of it's social media events, but because news travels so quickly, because one clip taken out of context can ruin your whole campaign, I think across the board, political leaders have pulled back in terms of what they're offering, in terms of Q&A. But Mark Carney's sort of status quo to me.
Okay. I mean, Amanda, just on that point, I mean, what more does Carney need to be doing on the campaign trail to hit that threshold for vetting that you would like to see? Because, everyone in my profession is quite upset that it's 4 questions, no follow-up with the Conservative campaign each and every day, and they try to pressure you into asking about specific things or you don't get a question, which is not really how it works. I mean, what more would you like to see from the Liberal leader on this?
I love the Liberal leader discloses investments and conflicts. I think that'd be a basic start that he has yet to do. And the argument is, he can do it in 3 months after the election's over with when we don't know what's happening. I'd love to know where does Mark Carney live? Has he lived in Canada over the last decade? He's given a bunch of colloquial answers that candidly demonstrate to me that he doesn't know a lot about the country. So it's all great that I think he's an accomplished man who's done a lot with his life, but there's also very clear evidence that he has not been like a regular person in this country. And to run this country in the midst of a crisis, I think we have a higher bar than I show up and do some photo ops and take some questions from journalists and then go away for 2 days and be PM and you can see me in some photo ops, and that's good. That's not good enough for me.
Okay, all right. I want to get to Cheryl's pick, but he has complied with the ethics guidelines as they exist, just to say that as a fact. And he's got a house in the Rockcliffe neighborhood of Ottawa. How much time he spent there, I'm not sure. Because he did work abroad with other things. Cheryl, let's get to your pick. What do you got for us today?
Okay, so candidate deadline day, and I'm just surprised that the Conservatives have decided to keep BC candidate Aaron Gunn, because he has a long history of social media posts where he has basically said that residential schools do not amount to genocide. He's rewritten history and said that First Nations asked for these schools. And then when all of this stuff has been posted publicly, rather than dumping him, like Pierre Poilievre did with other candidates, as the Liberals did with other candidates, Pierre Poilievre stands by him and says, no, despite First Nations leaders calling on this guy to be removed, no, he has always fought for First Nations rights. And I just think this is a crazy bar for them to set.
Right. I forgot to mention, too, that this is candidate nomination deadline day. You can't replace a candidate now. So happy Oppo Day to the people who work in the research bureaus of all the political parties finding dirt on candidates, because you're going to start dumping it now because it can't be replaced. Carney, what do you make of this? Aaron Gunn, filmmaker, controversial in British Columbia right now, someone personally recruited by Pierre Poilievre, and we've seen people dumped for lower controversies.
Yeah, and I mean, filmmaker is a bit of a stretch. If being a filmmaker is defined as going to the downtown east side and shoving a camera in the face of unconsenting, unhoused people, then maybe he's a filmmaker. But I digress. It is clear that this is a person who is welcome in Pierre Poilievre's version of the Conservative Party. I think what's most interesting to me about watching this debacle with Mr. Gunn is the amount of dissonance within the big blue tent that you're seeing. Because there's a number of right-wing media outlets that have been frequently and fervently coming to Mr. Gunn's defense for the things that he said about denying the impact of residential schools or the unmarked graves in Kamloops. And you also see people who are more moderate kind of expressing, their hope that the party would just lose the dead weight and move on so that they could get elected. I think that there's a real kind of a challenge in terms of the push-pull of, can you be moderate enough to be generally appealing enough to actually get enough seats to win an election, or do you pursue like an ideological purity and lose votes as a result? I mean, I think the fact that Mr. Gunn is still a candidate perhaps answers the question in terms of how Pierre Poilievre looks out on that. That being said, the fact that we're sitting here on a national television program talking about this person's views that are harmful, probably at worst, to some people, and at the very best case scenario, offensive to a much larger group of people, probably means that it's going to hurt the Conservative Party in other areas of the country well beyond the North Island of Vancouver Island.
Yeah. So, look, on the issue of residential schools, there are people who are horrified by residential schools and do not believe it meets the threshold of a genocide, though it has been described as a cultural genocide in this country. Amanda, Aaron Gunn has said this, and Pierre Poilievre is sticking by him. He said some things about Putin and Russia in the past that he disavowed later. But what do you make of his decision to stick by Mr. Gunn? Do you think it's the right call? Do you think this could potentially be a distraction for the Conservatives in BC?
I think time will tell as far as if it's the right call or not. I'm not, listen, I remain horrified by what happened with residential schools, and I think it's an important conversation we need to continue to have as a country. How the Conservative Party writ large and also as individuals choose to engage in that conversation is one that the leader and other folks will have to kind of decide on what meets their moral compass. What I will say is, I think, as we've kind of said, it's Oppo Day, and what this means more broadly is the stinkier, stickier, tougher Oppo pieces that they have on, all parties have on significant candidates and key ridings have been held back until the next week. So it is going to be, we're on Monday. I think it is going to be a very messy week for all of the parties on a variety of material issues. And, I think we'll see what meets the standard for all of them, including, we had the Liberals have a very similar challenge with hanging on to one of their candidates for 48 hours, a little longer than they probably should, well, definitely longer than they should have. That candidate was since sort of resigned on his own. So I think it'll be a test for all the leaders on how they respond. Yeah, Cheryl, this one, how do you think this one plays specifically? Because it is someone who was recruited by Pierre Poilievre and he seems personally invested in Aaron Gunn's candidacy. Does this just stay in that part of British Columbia or can it move out from there?
I think specifically in British Columbia, it has implications because there has been Conservative MLAs removed from the provincial Conservative caucus for views similar to this. And it asks the question for me, who is Pierre Poilievre trying to appeal to in British Columbia, much like Carlene said. But across the country, of course, this is an issue that people understand. Amanda raised, this is something that conservatives themselves are trying to grapple with. How do we talk about it? What's acceptable to say? And so I think it has specific implications in British Columbia, specifically for his riding. But I think this is a conversation that takes place across Canada, and people will have strong feelings about it no matter where they live.
Yeah, I think last week we had about 10 candidates preemptively dropped by the parties. I think there was some aggressive re-vetting going on, in anticipation of what might come after today. We don't have to re-vet any of you, but we're out of time. We've got to say goodbye. Carlene Verheyen, Amanda Galbraith, and Cheryl Oates, thanks for being here on Oppo Day, the beginning of it all. I'm David Cochran. Thank you all for watching Power and Politics. A programming note, as of today, CBC News Network is now free to watch until the 5th of May. You can watch Canada's #1 news network through your cable provider, on CBC Gem, at CBCNews.ca, and on the CBC News app. You can also watch Power and Politics live streaming on YouTube for the remainder of the federal election campaign. That's it for our show tonight. We're back in 22 hours with the next edition of the show, but Hannah Mansing Tonight is up here next on CBC News Network.